I imagine this is not easy to follow. Anyway, I'll at least continue because I think that these notes will at least they could be deciphered, and I could just use them to collate them into a more concise overview of the model and such. But it is probably, I feel it is necessary for myself to at least have this out in some form. Um, so I think I'll start off with some housekeeping. I'm just going to uh, make some notes on my last recording, the 53-minute one. So at the 21:40 minute mark, 21-minute 40-second mark, I believe I slightly, I think I said the wrong thing pretty much. When I said that the ego has to let itself be decomposed by the superego, that is actually correct. It is the very final step, but it's very convoluted, and I will actually get to that at the end. But as I was speaking about it in those early stages of, the sort of the gates you have to go through in order, it's the very last step, and so it's quite convoluted because, in some sense, it is the superego is much more directly related to the subconscious, and it is the superego's deconstruction of the subconscious which has an indirect knock-on effect um, with the ego. And after everything else is sort of has done what it needs to do in a particular kind of architecture or configuration, um, the final step is that the superego essentially exhausts the ego, and they, through that process, which is basically a kind of sequestration, the ego gets sequestrated into a redeemed being, um, through eventually just being completely suffocated because uh, the subconscious has no lifeblood preserving it, which is essentially the atmosphere and the ensconcement of the ego. Without the subconscious, there is no um, atmosphere. Uh, there is no cause for the ego uh, to have. I mean, obviously, after it's already been generated, then you have to do something with it. Because even just switching off the subconscious is not enough. You would have to uh, well, I mean, maybe in some functional sense, maybe if you have been able to completely deplete and stop the subconscious, then perhaps the ego and the superego have no, well, depending on, I guess, what else has happened. Anyway, I don't, there's no point in getting into the hypothetical, and I'll just go over the particular kind of model of therapeutic process that I'm going to outline. But anyway, at the 28:50 mark, when I was just talking about the kind of the political analogy, talking about the kind of the value extraction that needs to occur, and a way to kind of generate certainty within the subconscious focused, kind of cult. Um, One of another way of elaborating this is I think I said things like, there needs to be some kind of proven sacrifice to prove that there is value flowing within the kind of the subconscious focus culture. Another way of saying that is that, because it's unable to kind of be its own creditor, because it's unable to create its own positive motion, its own kind of proactive purpose, it has to be garnered by a kind of zero sum, so it has to come from something else. It has to, because essentially there are two ways of dealing in the subconscious. The first is effectively that you project your subconscious onto your environmental surroundings. So you're sort of some of this wording might sound self-contradictory, but basically the one thing is that you project your subconscious onto others and onto this almost sounds like the same thing when I get to the distinction, and or let me just say the other side, and then maybe I'll be able to work out the difference. And then the alternative essentially is to project yourself into the subconscious, and so the point is only ever exteriorize yourself into the subconscious. Don't ever project your subconscious onto your environment. Now, I think the main difference in that is essentially the when you exteriorize yourself into the subconscious, that means that the integrity of your ego is still, so in essence the subconscious is a foil that the ego is playing at, right? Whereas if you just merely project your subconscious onto your environment, that is fundamentally problematic for so many reasons, because essentially you are the entity in your imagination. You are the I can get into this kind of philosophically, but essentially what the subconscious is it's a way of contemplating activity. It's sort of like it's the matrix and character of all verbs in existence. It is the motion in the world. It is the way of describing the weights and the measurements and the knowledge of how the world works. And so it's kind of like it's the some kind of formalized notional conceptual category system of adjectives. So it's what gives color to adjectives in the mind. Okay, so if you project that onto your environment, then you are incepted in that matrix. Whereas if you maintain the ego, and you exteriorize the subconscious around the ego, which is essentially what the function of the ego is, essentially to critique the subconscious, is to sort of counteract it, is to sort of be a controlling mechanism for the subconscious, because the subconscious effectively is I mean, I don't want to get into my terminology, although I think the terminology of my system, which I have not even begun to introduce, is essentially that the subconscious is the vanity and being drawn away into the lust, which I have not even but basically the lust would be representative. The death and the lust are both inherent sort of in the unconscious, and the death is the death of the free will, in essence, and which is kind of somewhat hidden from itself because of its kind of implicit solipsism and complete mastery. So it's the unconscious is fundamentally untouchable, and so it creates the puppet, the puppet matrix for itself to interface with something that could at least be challenging and interesting and intriguing, and sort of, and so that is what the knowledge of the world is according to its mastery. It's already kind of conceptual mastery behind the scenes. But it becomes, when the knowledge of the world becomes close enough to being complete, which is kind of like the end of infancy. Sort of generally this can occur around, I think it's actually started occurring younger, but generally from the ages of 3 to 7 is when this phase is usually mostly done. You see, phases don't have to be completely finished for the next phase to already begin. They have to just sort of be already anticipated as being completed, and then they still get fill out slightly. And certain avenues might, that this is anyway, I'm not going to get into that tangent, but so what I would say is the and then the lust effectively is the unlimited power that the unconscious and has it is an irresistible master of its domain effectively, and that is why it has the power to construct a matrix that puts the whole world into it and categorizes and understands according to that lust, according to that irresistible force. Now, so lust, in some sense, in this sense, this is fundamentally what the ego develops to, in a sense, critique. The ego is the trial and the sin, essentially. But the trial is the primary aspect of the ego, which is that it is putting the subconscious on trial. And this, well, it's not actually putting the subconscious on trial, it's putting yourself on trial. But this is the problem, is that the concept, the notion of yourself is branched into many different fragmented entities, and so the kind of the convoluted sort of internal chess game sort of occurs. And then essentially what happens is, when the verdict of the trial, you sentence yourself essentially to an eternal recurring you essentially either go back to the unconscious, or you go back to the subconscious, or you sort of get evicted from the whole complex entirely, and sort of well, in a virtual sense, and you try to amalgamate everything into perhaps the subconscious, and you try to sort of get the subconscious to grab and combine the powers and the roles of the fragments, in their kind of dysfunctional array and architecture. And different concoctions of these would be like different psychiatric conditions, probably, and such. So the okay, let me think what I want to talk about specifically. So yeah, no, you see, these things, I'd rather not. It would take too long to properly elaborate all of my terminology from my system. Let me just try stay to the four sides MBTI. So yeah, so that has been my main impetus for my ontological model of the four sides MBTI, is my typology and my model, which I'm not going to talk about directly, but what was I talking about? I was talking about the subconscious. Oh yeah, to Yeah. So to me, I've said this before, the subconscious is the most dangerous and delusional aspect of all the three. It is the kind of the uh, it is the battleground for sanity in some sense, and because it has to be, at some point it has to hopefully be used, it has to be properly harnessed, um, and sort of, and now the way to generally the way to actually developing meta development, which is the topic of these recordings, is effectively to take the Stoic path and to confront the internal tensions and to not take the easy and convenient sort of exterior projections and such. And so, you know, so usually, people will get to a certain level of development, and then they will essentially, well, there are lots of ways. I mean, there's no real pervasive excuse, like people can invent excuses out of nothing. Um, but I guess generally you could say that I don't want to get too much into a cultural commentary, but there are, within culture, there are tropes, there are stereotypes, there are grooves within culture that are almost promoting and advertising roles for certain types, for certain species of subtype, that, it's sort of like, well, this is a known trope, this is a known function that you can do within the culture. The culture has a certain, and in some sense, there might be laid out journeys, pre-packaged, sort of evolutionary, lowest common denominator kind of so there might be somewhat forces that are inherited as a kind of cultural residue in which people sort of go down recurring ideological, or when I say recurring, I meant to say a kind of a self a reproducing, so essentially, a lot of these things, I feel like they're almost like stable spider webs that have existed because they're capable of reproducing themselves and sucking people into their vortex, essentially. I don't want to steal the self-determinism and accountability of people that allow themselves to get sucked into such things. Yeah, but there are many intrigue and sort of tasty drama and sort of drowning out of alternative virtuous schemas, and paths to take and such. Um, Let me say. Yeah, so I do think that within my distinction, it is becoming more clear to myself, at least. Only ever exteriorize yourself into the subconscious. So in that sense, even though you will be enacting it in some sense or engaged in it, you're engaged in it almost consciously as a foil of your activity, that you're sort of like, it's like, that you're putting on a play. That you're sort of acting through a hypothetical scenario in your head. That you're imagining it. Whereas if you're projecting the subconscious onto your environment, you're somewhat seeing is believing at that point. And you can see this, for example, in the sort of the ideologically possessed identity politics intersectional people, that they're sort of their ideological framework and certainty is just kind of presumed behind everything. And this is, it's crazy that they will sort of, they will force you, I've heard it said, but I've also experienced this myself, they will force you uh, to defend the argument that they put into your mouth. It's anyway. And you can also see that when you exteriorize yourself into the subconscious, you are the subject. Whereas if you project your subconscious onto your environment, the environment is the subject. And so there's already a kind of disembodiment that is occurring in the second form. There's a hollowness, which is actually that connotates, I believe, to the notion itself of the spirit of man, which is essentially there are only two spirits in the scriptural doctrine, essentially, that the spirit of God is the spirit of truth, of authority, of kind of integrity, in some sense, of having a purpose, having a proactive conceptual heading that one is conceiving of, whereas the spirit of man is effectively the way of being camouflaged by one's environmental conditioning and imprinted on by the exterior, and reacting to it as a beast, as one without will, or without a free will, and that the will is subjugated to the passions, and the kind of the archetypal symbol of the spirit of man is the serpent, which crawls on its hunger, it crawls on its belly, it tastes only dust. This is the idea of living in your imagination alone. The idea that yourself in the future is you, and therefore you can work towards this future self, and you never get to experience life in the present because you're working towards the identity. You're working for the identity, and it's just labeled as yourself. And so you've actually hollowed out yourself, and it becomes part of that adjective inception, or that an adjective in the subconscious knowledge of the world. It becomes a part of that knowledge of the world. And in fact, there is the yourself that is in the world is not the vehicle that you are articulating life from. That is just the tool for the concept of the identity. Okay. At the 37-minute mark, I think I might have said unconscious when I meant to say subconscious, because I was talking about the unconscious and the subconscious, and I was talking about it quite quickly, and so if I say the word unconscious, if I said the word subconscious way too many times, although I was also talking about the subconscious in relation to the unconscious, that might be a little hard to decipher. But anyway, at the 40-minute mark, I was trying to mention a phrase talking about that when someone is subconscious focused, that essentially what they are doing, one of the things that they have to do as a mark of subsuming the role of the unconscious, and sort of bringing the unconscious and the ego into a weird kind of overlaid conflation within the realm of the subconscious, sort of compacting both of those forces into the organs of the subconscious. What I think a mark of that is, and I think I did later sort of elaborate into this, but I just wanted to point it out, is that is that the subconscious adopts the unconscious's power to be the kind of the lawgiver, the puppet master. And so what it has to be able to do, and this is generally what is in philosophy regarded as relativism, is that it has to be able to kind of through some mechanical fiat, it has to be able to uh, perform the reassignment of transgression. It has to be able to um, have the levers of control over the concept of transgression. Um, it that might also be too strongly worded, because it might not. It might be a more general concept than transgression. It might be transgression and virtue. So that they can also redefine virtue on the spot. So I thought that it was important that I elaborate on that, and that in some sense the way to link both of those things is that it is the representative of morality. It is moral authority incarnate. And anyway, and that it is essentially the mark of the solipsism that the unconscious mind is actually the kind of the fabricator thereof, and the sort of. But generally, because another way of thinking of the unconscious mind is that it is purely a bank of beliefs. It doesn't have feelings. It is like a constitution. It is just written out, kind of. So it has to, it's you can almost imagine it as a tablet that has engravings in it, and perhaps there is a process in which those can be slightly recoded and reordered and such, but it's just like a kind of the source code that the subconscious also requires to be built upon. The subconscious can't be erected. It can't be powered without that source code. It is like the fundamental principles upon which the knowledge of the world can start to be amassed. You have to have a kind of a computer with a memory bank or something. So in some sense, the the operating system is like the unconscious mind, and the hard drive is like the subconscious. Unless you've got the kind of the operating system running, you don't start to get an accumulated bank of workings of the world. That anyway. And in some sense, the ego does become the user of that. Um, at the 44-minute mark, I was talking about full-blown fascists and how they kind of perhaps fit in what their kind of pathology is. Now, I don't want this to be taken the wrong way, but I do think that in some sense, yeah, this is going to be taken the wrong way. Um, I do think that in some way, most of the best cultures in the world, and you have to realize I'm taking this from a psychological perspective. Um, now, you see, this is not actually true, because you see, the Nazi society is certainly it's weird, because the Nazi society really is a two-tier system where most of the people are subconscious focused, like the vast majority, and then there are just like a handful of people that sort of are above it, but it's kind of like an inside joke or something like that, and so they kind of just kind of hover over it. It really is a strange kind of two-tier society, and so in some sense, most people are subconscious focused useful idiots. And then you get the kind of the incredibly jaded people that are willing to put up with that kind of degraded culture and society, and that kind of that pathetic moral authority, which just, so uh, if you read the book um, Brave New World, it's something like the difference between the kind of the algorithmic culture and then the people that sort of control the algorithms and the world controllers. It's that kind of thing. Although the world controllers in Brave New World, I mean, it's not quite the same thing. Um, but the world controllers in Brave New World uh, were not jaded in the same way that fascists are jaded. Like, uh, uh, let's say, fully conscious fascists that are in the leadership. Um, they're taking on a form of collective responsibility uh, that is so toxic and that is so hard to justify even in their own mentality. It must be quite convenient to be in the middle management, as it were, or to sort of to be in the leadership but not to be near the very top, because it's very easy to just say that, well, it's not on my soul, it's not on my it's sort of it's almost like returning to the divine right of kings. It's almost like, well, it's all by way of the sovereign. It's all by in the name of the sovereign, who is the representative of God here on earth. It is that kind of and then obviously uh, it's fine if you're living as a king back in the day, because then you have a church kind of perpetuating this kind of this the, um, perpetuating a kind of propaganda and sort of basis for preserving and perpetuating and reproducing this system. Whereas if you are doing it as a fascist, I think you end up taking risks and gambles just to prove that that God is on your side, or that you're on God's side. And you have to because the kind of rhetoric that you are forced to engage in, the kind of things that you have to say, essentially, is that um, if anyone is not acting according to its fiat, according to its moral authority, it must be destroyed, it must be dismantled, it must be punished. And so, when you take on the role of that moral authority, it must be easier on the psyche to be in the middle management. It must be much easier, because in some sense it's always easier to imagine that the source of that, that pseudo divinity, that kind of that um, is is being felt emotionally by other people, and you can kind of, it's easier to imagine it when you're just kind of part of a kind of a collective cog in a giant machine, and that is part of the ideology, so it's a very elaborate way of concealing in a kind of drama and a kind of intrigue, and so to sort of to be a humble, when I say humble, to be an intellectually humble person in the middle management of a fascist culture, then you sort of you have to know that it's all built on essentially convenient mass delusion, for the convenience of the leadership and for the convenience of having a concentration of power that can act decisively or something like that. And the right of a political entity to act decisively is that, I guess, that all its members are its organs and such. And so you have the kind of the nation state as the model of a church, but with a kind of authoritarian leadership, uh, um, where the moral authority flows from the top down, not from the bottom up. Although it gets its motivation from the bottom up, because all of its organs are said to be kind of in the family, and so the idea that the ring of power includes all, and that it theoretically includes all who it deserves to, who only then deserve to be preserved and protected and secured. So it's got this really awful kind of strange, complete destruction of a kind of individual mental autonomy, and so it really does force people to get sucked into the subconscious delusion, which is problematic, because you will see the IQ points eroded. You will see, and it's only the people that sort of make it into the leadership that then, perhaps, I don't know how many circles in the leadership, they actually have disdain, for their collective. They actually have disdain for how pathetic they have sort of hollowed out, and so essentially, then you get a completely two-tier society where, you have to believe that the cream will always rise to the top and the rest must just sort of um, be there as a kind of as a kind of genetic bank or something like that, or who knows. You know, this is the fundamental problem: is that it starts to debase itself. It can't. I don't see how it sustains its own kind of propaganda, but so sort of to engage in that, to me, it is only alluring to someone who can only imagine that, you really have to believe that you're being threatened. You really have to believe that you have a collective existential threat, which is why, it always generates these mythologies of infiltration, of structural oppression. This is the lifeblood of fascistic values, is the concept of structural oppression, because structural oppression can never be disproved. By definition, it exists. It's obviously a very stupid way of thinking of problems and such, but essentially this is the kind of way that now, it's strange. So this is what happens when you navigate the world through identity, right? Um, and I would say that most people, in their psyches, in most good cult or in not good cultures, but in the best cultures historically that have existed, you get people that eventually, or not eventually, that end up, the general normative way of thinking about things is to think through life through the rubric of identity, right? Now, generally people can't do this across the board, because if you literally interfaced with life through identity, I mean, you get into that kind of paranoia and that kind of jaded, compromised, very strange kind of I mean, you basically become a psychopath. You become a narcissistic psychopath as well. Um, so you can't do it across the board. So I would say generally people did it, and then they kind of confined it to some extent. They confined it to their out group or something like that. They confined it to interactions that they didn't really have on a day-to-day basis. And if they did have actual experience, then those views were very quickly um, collapsed into a more genuine, authentic engagement. Now you have the opposite happening, because of the culture essentially encourages people to sort of invest into the kind of the narcissistic um, identity zero sum games and such. But this is problematic in its own right. Um, because it does cause also a spiraling kind of escalation, because sadly, one of the ways of defending yourself from an opposing utilizer of identity is to defend yourself with the same instrument that has been used against you. And so it does have a kind of a very toxic, proliferating effect. And it's even more toxic when you say, well, some people are allowed to do it because that's social justice, and other people aren't allowed to do it because they're racist. It's ludicrous. Anyway, I don't want to get into the political tangent too much, but so I do think that in some level, I mean, I remember when I was growing up, when I was even 7 years old, that identity thinking was how a lot of, no, I think it had to be later than 7. I think it had maybe around 8 and 9. That identity thinking, you could tell that these were low IQ people that were engaging in identity thinking, essentially so that they didn't have to continue to think through things. So that they could do less work in terms of engaging authentically with things. And, on some level, I would say that it's perhaps even excusable when it doesn't have a real consequence or a real cost. When it doesn't actually have a fallout, or, when it's not pertinent to one's life, that you have a kind of abstract, and, well, yeah, so in some sense, I'm slightly sympathetic that it's not always necessarily toxic. As long as, obviously it's better when it's done, if it's done in a way that the person understands that it's completely tentative and that it's wholly inoperable, but it's a starting point. It's a starting point of a future interrogation if it ever becomes important to sort of interrogate and pursue that line or that train of assessment. But generally, people aren't willing to tolerate the fear of living in a world in which they only know what they know, and what they don't know is just a kind of evening of not yet known. They can't distinguish between the evening and the darkness, and so they would rather abolish what they project as darkness as identity in this sense. And they need the identity to be stable, and so they cling on to it rather than allowing it to be sacrificed and reforged, and displaced by real inquiry and authentic engagement. They're not willing to have working models of identity that are fundamentally tentative and disposable. There is an aspect here that has to do with the kind of the politics of the impersonal, which is in fact something that will in some way always be monitored and regulated by a kind of collective, cultural, generalized sort of statistical reading of what things are likely to be and likely not to be. And that will, perhaps be a superficial currency of views. But I mean, that is a superficial aspect of culture that is impossible to abolish. You're not going to be able, I mean, things that are impersonal are by definition not directly known. Okay, like that is something that has to be fundamentally tolerated. The kind of the unwillingness to sort of have a kind of stoic resolve around such subjects um, is often because there is some kind of projected subconscious condition that has to be met. Um, Obviously, if the ego was involved, because the ego is fundamentally critical of the subconscious. The ego is the kind of is the afterthought, is the conscience of the subconscious, and so the ego is a kind of third pro because it's sort of it's the end of the whole it's the end of it's the final stage in a three-stage process. It is the most filtered, the most sophisticated. um you know Now the problem is actually that most people don't get to the point of observing their own sin. They have these looming trials, um, which generally can only be diverted. Um, and this was what I was getting to when I was talking about the sword of Damocles, talking about the subconscious. Is that it is only through the observation of one's own sin that eventually the subconscious, you get into that one, you get into the finally the next stage of meta development, of maturity, where you start examining your unconscious, um, when you start grappling with the unconscious and you start seeing um, the kind of the tail, the sort of the grabbing your own tail sort of thing that is actually occurring within the subconscious, and the kind of and the drama that the kind of the repetitive drama that is being self-engineered and sort of indulged in. And when the subconscious starts being unmasked as a kind of as the indulgence of the unconscious itself, and that in fact you can almost see that the subconscious, you don't even have to go into it, that you could literally just predict all the potential narratives and all the kind of the scripts that might sort of play out. You can see those things in their full elaborated potential just by examining the unconscious. And then you realize that essentially you are just the pawn of that thing, which is the unconscious. And that now you don't really get to that if you never observe your own sin. And this is generally why in the fascist culture there is no such thing as a kind of as an individual transgression in some sense. Everything is a kind of utilitarian value that is the moral authority and the moral consideration is to this collective identity that you belong, this collective family that you belong. And so, because there's no individual principle, you actually have a way of completely cutting out the observation of sin and bypassing the ego. Um, and so you can almost get to the point where, because you've got this kind of this relativistic identity driven moral authority, and that has all the might of all moral consideration, and you sort of you believe that the whole world has been incepted into the same program, into the same way, although they might be running different, in different regions, and sort of be a part of a different legion of this kind of style of dominion. Um, Essentially, what happens in the subconscious focus, and I think I did point this out in the other thing, is that the ego, in some way, a way of seeing it is that the subconscious collapses itself into nothing, although I mean this in a virtual sense. And all that's really happening is that the ego and the unconscious are sharing their traditional functions and roles in the facility of the subconscious. So it's like the subconscious is not a thing, it's everything. And so it's not itself anymore. And in fact, so it's almost as if it abolishes itself as the hypothetical imagined conceptual being. It's like that is reality. There's no difference between its kind of ideological conception of things and framing of things and reality itself. And so, in some way, it is the ego and the unconscious just dovetailed in this kind of hodgepodge thing, and it's both of those energies of the unconscious being the kind of the lawgiver puppet master, and the ego being the conscience. These things are just kind of completely in a kind of in a strange collusion with each other, and they are operating the machinery of the subconscious, the facilities of the subconscious, the particular cognitive functions in the subconscious. Now, this is fundamentally problematic because it's sort of there are so many inherent contradictions with this. Now, I'm going to also say something else, that in some way, everything that I've just said in reverse is actually the kind of the therapy for actually meta development. So instead of actually indulging in this, you actually have to almost simulate doing this, but doing it in a way in which that you hate that it's happening, that you hate that it is occurring, and that also what is occurring. You have to kind of simulate doing it in some sense. But you do it not in the way that like the subconscious becomes everything. You do it in the way in which, as I said, you exteriorize yourself into the subconscious. You don't project the subconscious onto everything. And so, so you're doing this in essence as a bleached yourself. That yourself is a kind of this may be a bad analogy, is like a scientist or something like that, and is pouring these things together like they're beakers, and such. So when you're doing this as a kind of as a creative destruction in some sense, that you're doing this knowing full well how artificial these substances are that you're sort of amalgamating and commingling, and also with an appreciation that these substances are fundamentally at odds with each other. So you're doing this consciously, that the ego and the unconscious are actually antagonistic to one another. So you're not doing it in such a way in which you're actually marrying them. You're doing it in such a way as that you are putting them together to have a kind of a violent reaction to each other, but because you're doing it exterior to it, you're watching it blow up in the beaker. You're not sort of projecting that explosion onto reality. That's perhaps a bit convoluted, but I haven't even gotten into it. Okay, so now I don't know if I actually got into the whole particular analogy of the mother and the father, and the daughter and the son, and the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law. So I have finished actually sketching out the model, and it bears a very deep resemblance to the plot of The Matrix, which is actually not a surprise at all, but I'm not going to elaborate on that. So you have okay, I'm just going to run through this. I'm not going to sort of run through it at a pace at which it's going to be. I'm just going to fully describe it if someone, just so that there's a recording of it. If someone's interested in it, they can just, they can sort of lay it out from my descriptions. Okay, so essentially, the major setup is you have the daughter-in-law and the father, and the mother in sort of in parentheses as well, but that's the very last step. That's why I've got it sketched out in a kind of in a jotted in sort of perforated parentheses. So you've got the daughter-in-law, the father, and the mother in perforated parentheses versus the mother-in-law and the son. Okay, so the first thing that essentially happens is okay, no, before I get into the interactions between them, let me just say, so on the side that the daughter-in-law and the father, you have to remember that the daughter-in-law and the father are actually, I believe that they're fundamentally connected. The daughter-in-law, I'm continuing from the last recording, so the daughter-in-law is the parent function of the subconscious. Now, the daughter-in-law being the parent function of the subconscious is intrinsically connected to the child function of the father, which is the unconscious. So, and which I've already laid out, is like the child function of the unconscious is the architect of the matrix, which is the subconscious. But now I'm not going to talk about the daughter, which is the matrix, because the daughter is fundamentally I'm not going to talk about the daughter because the daughter is fundamentally displaced by talking about the daughter-in-law and the mother-in-law, which are both the components of the subconscious, which are the primary components. So the daughter-in-law being the parent function in the subconscious, and the mother-in-law being the child function of the subconscious. And the child function essentially represents the motivation in the subconscious, the kind of the value, which is the kind of the driving force of the entire perspective and the entire it is the entire value of it. And the daughter-in-law is essentially the dedication to that motivation, and you notice that they are opposed to one another. They are on the opposite side of the versus line. So essentially, it's very unstable for the daughter-in-law to be opposed to the mother-in-law. I think in the Matrix, the analogy would go that the daughter-in-law is like the Merovingian, and the mother-in-law is the what did they call her? The prophet? I can't remember. The fortune teller? No, I can't remember. But the oracle, that's what they called her. Okay, so so essentially what happens is the daughter-in-law steals the eyes of the oracle. Okay, and so, but doesn't know, has no way of using them properly, essentially, because the eyes themselves are using them. Uh, the use of the eyes are the eyes. And because the daughter-in-law cannot use the eyes, it has maimed the mother-in-law. And so the mother-in-law itself no longer has a kind of motivation. Well, yeah, so already the daughter-in-law and the mother-in-law being separated, being opposed to one another, in essence almost cancels out both of them. It defangs both of them being opposed to one another. And generally the parent and the child function are working in tandem. It's the most solid part of each side of the mind. It's the most solid part of any type is the child and the parent, because they're on the same axis and they're on they're in the middle of the type. They can work together, and so they are the most kind of influential core and mover. Okay, and so as I've already said, the child sort of motivates, represents the motivation, and the parent represents the dedication for that motivation. Is the sort of the instrument of the motivation that it does service to by its dedication. Now, what I've really tried to say is that the parent function of the subconscious, which is the daughter-in-law, is most closely connected to the architect, the child of the unconscious. These things are almost fundamentally they're also on the same axis, but they're on the same axis in terms of I'll just say it like that. They're yeah, they also share an axis. So I don't. The reason why I'm not saying it is because I just don't know how to name the two different types of axes. I haven't absorbed all the jargon from MBTI, but if you follow, you'll probably know that how to describe it more than I do. But anyway, you know to what I refer. The axis that is the different the perceiving judging axis, the axis that consists of a perceiving and judging function. So I'm doubting myself. No, that is correct. Yeah. No, it's not the yeah, it's the axis that is the same judging or yeah, so sorry, excuse me, but yeah, it shares the same axis, but it's the one that is always of the same type. So it's just extroverted or introverted. Okay. Okay, let me move on finally. So the daughter-in-law and the father are connected. So in this analogy, it's like the Merovingian after stealing the eyes from the oracle, and the architect are kind of like on the same side. With the mother, which is the superego, remember, and the mother-in-law is the oracle. Okay, part of the matrix. So now, essentially, because the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law, I did have a more elaborate way of describing this, but basically, because the dedication is dislocated from the motivation, and now because the motivation has been maimed by the dedication, wanting to kind of be dedicated to itself, wanting to find a way to be dedicated to itself, and actually it can't use the eyes properly, because the only way that it was able to be dedicated to it was because there was a separation. There were different fragments that could kind of, through their division, they could recycle whatever tension actually metaphysically existed. That metaphysical tension could be concealed, and so now, because it's a unipole, because it's all existing in the daughter-in-law, it's a poison pill. So it doesn't know what to do with that visionary power. Now, this actually, I believe, corresponds with the scriptural description of the false prophet in the lake of fire. And the eyes of the oracle is actually the lake of fire, and the daughter-in-law is the false prophet. Now, the actual sort of putting the false prophet into the lake of fire is what happens when the son does battle with the father, essentially. And the son being the ego and the father being the unconsciousness. Because then when the son goes after the father, in this context, it completely sequestrates the father. And it actually, through the father's link with the daughter-in-law, which is because the father's child is connected with the same access to the parent, that is what actually allows that when that event occurs, essentially the son, in sequestrating the father, has also allowed itself to start being sequestrated by the mother. Because now, when the son sequestrates the father, after the daughter-in-law has been able to get the eyes of the oracle, the eyes of the mother-in-law, at that point, the subconscious effectively collapses, which was the atmosphere that the son even needed to survive, to breathe. And so when the son sequestrates the father, the false prophet is put into the lake of fire. Now, this is an ongoing thing. This doesn't ever stop. The kind of the the mother-in-law being maimed by the daughter-in-law, and then essentially the architect being dressed down by the son. That is an on that sequestration is a kind of is a constant work, is a constant process that never ends, and the execution of that sequestration is the act of the mother bearing down against the son and exhausting whatever charge the son still had from whatever cause that it could generate by association to the subconscious, which is, basically dissolved. And so the mother's sequestration of the son is sequestrating it into a redeemed being. And so the ego is becoming redeemed, essentially by the exhaustion. That confrontation is the proof of the exhaustion of the subconscious mind, which the son needs proof of that exhaustion so that it has no more charge. Because it only has energy as much as it is reacting to the matrix, to the subconscious. So, said another way, the people that are living in the matrix, while there are still people living in the matrix, there's still people that need to be unplugged from the matrix. There's still living blood in there. That's like, the great city of Babylon and the blood of the saints, containing the blood of the saints. That is the same concept. So, in as much as there's still blood in those stones, the New Jerusalem is not yet fully populated, essentially. That's almost a mixed metaphor, because it's not as if you're saving people from the city. The blood is already of people that have been killed, but until the blood is sort of redeemed or resolved in some strange metaphor, but while there's still blood in those stones, there is still a captive. There's a purchase on the son. There's a purchase on the ego. There's a captivation still by the mother, which almost in the mixed metaphor would be like the whore of Babylon. But anyway, just to continue this metaphor slightly, the unconscious would be the beast, probably, and the superego would be the whore that worships the beast. But anyway, I don't want to go too much. Okay, I think I've actually covered the model. Obviously, it needs more substantiation and more details, and I might have contradicted myself in the earlier recording because I had not fully sort of worked through all these things, and I'm just reading off my notes now, but I did actually write profusely some explanations which I have not gone over, which would, when I have more energy, I'll make another recording probably.